The dig site sits at the edge of a dry river basin in southeastern Turkey, 40 kilometers from the nearest paved road. The air carries the smell of calcified earth and something older, mineral-dense, almost metallic, the kind of scent that geologists associate with deep time. It is 2004. A routine excavation team, contracted to survey the region ahead of an infrastructure project, has just broken through a layer of compacted sedite approximately 4 meters below the surface. What emerges from the ground does not fit the scale of anything in their field manual. A femur bone, human in morphology, unmistakably human, but measuring 120 centimeters in length. For context, a standard adult human femur measures approximately 45 centimeters. The bone in this trench is nearly 3 times that size. The proportional math, applied conservatively, suggests a standing height of somewhere between 14 and 16 feet. The lead archaeologist photographs it, then photographs it again, as though repetition might produce a different result. The measurements are taken 3 times by 3 different team members. The numbers do not change. Within 72 hours, the site is reclassified. Access is restricted. The official report, filed weeks later, lists the find as geological formation non-biological. The photographs are archived. The team is quietly dispersed to separate projects across different countries. This would be an isolated incident, an anomaly easily dismissed, except that it is not isolated, not even close. From the Ohio Valley burial mounds of the 19th century to the cave systems of Sardinia, to the megalithic plateau regions of Ecuador, to the pre-dynastic tomb excavations along the Upper Nile, the same impossible measurements keep surfacing, the same administrative responses keep following, and the same silence keeps descending. Ancient texts from Sumeria, Canaan, Greece, the Norse highlands, and the indigenous oral traditions of 6 separate continents describe a race of beings who walked this earth before recorded. Civilization, beings of extraordinary physical magnitude who built, ruled, and then vanished. For 2 centuries, mainstream archaeology has called them mythology. But what happens when mythology starts leaving bones? Before we continue to dive into more research, please like, share, subscribe, and comment your thoughts. The story that modern archaeology tells about early humanity is, on its surface, a clean and comfortable one. Homo sapiens emerged from Africa approximately 300,000 years ago. For the vast majority of that span, our ancestors lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers, small, scattered, cognitively capable but technologically primitive. Then, roughly 12,000 years ago, something shifted. Agriculture appeared. Settlements formed. Civilization, as the textbooks define it, began its slow and linear ascent from mud-brick villages to city-states to empires. Within this framework, there is no room for giants. There is no architectural space in the accepted model for a race of physically dominant, architecturally sophisticated beings predating the civilizations we already know. And so, the academic establishment has done what institutions under pressure typically do. It has drawn a hard perimeter around the acceptable evidence and defended that perimeter with professional consensus. The official position is unambiguous. Ancient giants are mythological constructs. The Nephilim of the Hebrew texts, mythological. The Anakim, described in the Book of Numbers as being so large that ordinary men felt like grasshoppers standing beside them, allegorical. The Titans of Greek cosmology, the Jotnar of Norse tradition, the Rephaim of Canaanite scripture, all classified as cultural metaphor, poetic exaggerations born from primal fear, from the human need to explain the inexplicable through narrative. Mainstream anthropology further argues that the occasional discovery of unusually large skeletal remains can be attributed to pathological conditions, gigantism, acromegaly, or simple misidentification of animal bones by untrained excavators. The framework is airtight in its logic, self-reinforcing in its assumptions. But frameworks, however elegantly constructed, cannot survive indefinitely against physical evidence. And the physical evidence, accumulating quietly across 2 centuries of documented excavation, has been building a case that the official narrative was never designed to answer. The first documented anomaly in the modern archaeological record appears not in a remote jungle or an uncharted desert, but in the pages of the Smithsonian Institution's own annual reports. Between 1848 and 1890, field agents operating across the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys submitted detailed excavation reports describing skeletal remains of extraordinary size recovered from ancient burial mounds. These were not casual observations made by untrained civilians. These were credentialed surveyors, operating under federal mandate, filing formal reports to one of the most powerful scientific institutions in the Western world. The measurements they recorded, skeletal remains ranging from 7 to 12 feet in standing height, appear in black ink in official government documentation, filed and catalogued, and then, at some point in the early 20th century, effectively vanished from accessible public record. That disappearance alone constitutes an inconsistency worth examining, but it is far from the only one. In 1833, soldiers digging at Lompoc Rancho in California unearthed a burial site containing a skeleton measured at approximately 12 feet. The remains were surrounded by carved shells, stone axes, and granite mortars of unusual scale, tools proportioned not for standard human hands. Local newspapers covered the discovery. Then the coverage stopped. The remains were reportedly taken by individuals who identified themselves as scientists. No institutional record of the retrieval survives. Move further back in the timeline, and the inconsistencies compound. The megalithic structures of Baalbek in Lebanon contain foundation stones, the so-called trilithons, each weighing in excess of 800 tons. The largest single-worked stone on the site, known as the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, weighs an estimated 1,200 tons. Modern engineers, using current heavy lift technology, acknowledge they cannot replicate the transportation and placement of these stones with any existing machinery. The accepted historical attribution assigns their construction to Roman engineers working in the 1st century BCE, but the Romans themselves, in their own writings, expressed bewilderment at the foundation stones already present when they arrived, stones they did not place and could not explain. This pattern of anomalous scale, anomalous precision, and anomalous erasure does not belong to one culture, one continent, or one epoch. It belongs to the entire span of human prehistory, distributed with a consistency that random chance cannot adequately explain. Something or someone has been systematically edited out of the record, and the deeper one excavates, literally and archivally, the clearer the outline of that absence becomes. Set aside for a moment the institutional explanations. Set aside the pathology diagnoses, the misidentification arguments, the comfortable dismissals, and consider what the cumulative evidence drawn from archaeology, ancient texts, oral traditions, and architectural forensics actually points toward when examined without the filter of academic orthodoxy. It points toward this, that prior to the civilizations we recognize, prior to Sumer, prior to dynastic Egypt, prior to the Indus Valley settlements, there existed on this earth a race of beings of extraordinary physical stature. Not supernatural, not extraterrestrial, human in biology but divergent in scale, a population whose physical magnitude was matched by a technological and organizational sophistication that the accepted timeline of human development has no framework to accommodate. The ancient texts do not speak about these beings in the language of fantasy. They speak about them in the language of history. The Book of Enoch, one of the oldest religious texts in existence, predating the canonical Bible by centuries and considered authoritative scripture by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and the Dead Sea Scrolls community at Qumran, describes in precise, administrative detail a class of beings called the Watchers who produced offspring of immense physical size. These offspring, the Nephilim, are described not as monsters but as builders, rulers, and warriors, beings who shaped the physical landscape of the ancient world before a catastrophic global event erased them from the surface of the earth. The Sumerian king list, a genuine archaeological artifact housed in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, records pre-flood rulers whose reign lengths span tens of thousands of years. Mainstream scholarship dismisses these figures as mythological inflation, but the document itself is treated as historically credible in every other respect. The selective application of skepticism to only those elements that contradict the accepted timeline is not rigorous science. It is motivated reasoning dressed in academic language. The Vedic texts of ancient India describe the Daityas and Danavas, races of gigantic beings who preceded the current human age, and whose physical remains were said to be buried beneath mountains and beneath the floors of ancient seas. The Mayan Popol Vuh describes multiple prior races of humanity, each more physically powerful than the last, destroyed by successive catastrophes. The Hopi oral tradition speaks of the first and second worlds, populated by beings of a scale that current humanity does not represent. 6 continents, dozens of independent civilizations, zero cross-cultural contact in the ancient world by the mainstream account, and yet the same story with the same dimensions, the same catastrophic ending, and the same institutional burial appearing everywhere simultaneously, as though describing not mythology but memory. The alternative theory is not that giants were supernatural aberrations. It is that they were the dominant civilizing force of the antediluvian world, and that their systematic removal from the historical record is itself one of the most consequential acts of institutional suppression in the history of human knowledge. There is a particular quality to suppressed evidence. It does not disappear cleanly. It leaves traces in newspaper archives, in the personal correspondence of field archaeologists, in the footnotes of regional historical societies that were never important enough to warrant systematic erasure. And when those traces are followed with sufficient patience, they converge on a body of physical documentation that the official narrative has never successfully explained away. Begin with the mounds. Across the eastern United States, from the Great Lakes Basin southward through the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, and into the Gulf Coast region, There exist thousands of earthen mounds constructed by pre-Columbian peoples. The Hopewell and Adena cultures are the civilizations most frequently credited with their construction, but the skeletal remains recovered from these mounds, particularly during the intensive excavation period of the 19th century, consistently described a population that does not match the physical profile of any known Native American group from that region. In 1872, an excavation near Cayuga, New York, uncovered 17 skeletons in a single burial chamber. Eyewitness accounts and local newspaper reports described the tallest among them at over 9 feet in length. The skulls were noted as being of unusual proportion, elongated, with a double row of teeth. This detail, the double row of teeth, also called hypodontia in extreme form, appears repeatedly across independent excavation reports from different states, different decades, and different field teams. The consistency of this anatomical anomaly across geographically dispersed, unconnected reports is not something that mass hallucination or journalistic exaggeration adequately explains. The Smithsonian connection deepens considerably when the correspondence of John Wesley Powell is examined. Powell, the first director of the Bureau of American Ethnology, was instrumental in shaping the official academic position on pre-Columbian North American populations. Internal correspondence from his tenure reveals an active and deliberate effort to consolidate the collection and classification of anomalous skeletal remains under centralized federal oversight. What happened to those remains after consolidation is a question the institution has never answered with transparency. Freedom of information requests filed by independent researchers in the late 20th and early 21st centuries have returned responses describing records as lost, destroyed, or non-existent. A remarkable institutional amnesia for one of the world's most comprehensively archived scientific organizations. Across the Atlantic, the evidence is no less compelling. In Sardinia, the prehistoric Nuragic civilization left behind over 7,000 stone tower complexes whose construction methodology remains incompletely understood. Within several of these structures, excavations conducted in the 19th and early 20th centuries recovered skeletal fragments of atypical scale. Italian archaeologist Alberto Ferrero della Marmora documented several such finds in detail. His reports were published, briefly cited, and then quietly marginalized as the emerging consensus of mainstream Mediterranean archaeology calcified around a more containable narrative. In Ecuador, explorer and physician Javier Cabrera Darquea documented not only the famous engraved stones of Ica, which depict surgical procedures, astronomical observations, and extinct megafauna in impossible historical proximity, but also drew attention to local oral traditions describing a race of giants whose bones were said to rest in caves throughout the Andean highlands. Expeditions mounted to verify these traditions in the mid-20th century returned with fragmentary skeletal evidence that was submitted to Peruvian government authorities and subsequently disappeared from any accessible scientific registry. The pattern is not coincidental. It is structural. The evidence exists. It has been found, documented, reported, and handled, and at each stage of that handling, the same institutional gravity pulls it away from public scrutiny and toward administrative oblivion. Suppression of this magnitude does not happen accidentally. It does not emerge from bureaucratic inefficiency or the natural entropy of poorly maintained archives. It requires decision-making. It requires institutional will. And when the trajectory of that suppression is traced carefully through the organizations involved, the timelines of their interventions, and the motives those interventions serve, a coherent architecture of deliberate concealment begins to take shape. The Smithsonian Institution stands at the center of the North American chapter of this story. Founded in 1846, it rapidly assumed the role of supreme arbiter of American archaeological orthodoxy. By the latter half of the 19th century, it had established effective control over the classification, transportation, and storage of significant archaeological finds across the continental United States. This consolidation of authority was framed publicly as a matter of scientific organization, centralized expertise producing more rigorous outcomes than scattered regional efforts. But consolidation of evidence is also, structurally, consolidation of the power to suppress evidence. In 2014, a satirical news article fabricated a quote from a Smithsonian spokesperson admitting to the deliberate destruction of giant skeletal remains. The article was fictional, but the viral spread of that fabrication obscured a harder and more documentable truth. That genuine Freedom of Information Act requests, filed by legitimate researchers across multiple decades, have returned responses from the Smithsonian describing the absence of records that its own 19th century annual reports confirm were collected and submitted. The gap between what was documented as received and what is acknowledged as currently held is not a gap that institutional negligence alone can bridge. The Vatican's role in this suppression operates on a different axis, but toward a compatible end. The canonical Bible's treatment of the Nephilim is remarkably sparse. A handful of verses in Genesis, a scattering of references in Numbers and Deuteronomy, and the conspicuous absence of the Book of Enoch from the accepted scriptural canon. The decision to exclude Enoch, a text that treats the existence of giant offspring as historical fact rather than metaphor, was made by early church councils operating in the 4th and 5th centuries CE. The grounds for exclusion were theological, but the effect was the removal from mainstream religious consciousness of the most detailed ancient account of a pre-flood race of physically extraordinary beings. The motivations driving this institutional silence are not difficult to reconstruct. For the Smithsonian and the broader apparatus of Western academic archaeology, the admission that a physically dominant, technologically sophisticated race preceded known civilization would require a complete structural dismantling of the accepted human timeline, invalidating careers, curricula, funding frameworks, and the reputational architecture of 2 centuries of credentialed scholarship. The institutional cost of admission is, by any professional calculation, catastrophic. For the Vatican and the broader Abrahamic religious establishment, the implications are theological rather than academic, but no less destabilizing. If the Nephilim were biological reality, if the antediluvian world described in suppressed scripture was populated by a dominant non-standard human race, then the carefully managed boundary between sacred history and natural history dissolves in ways that doctrinal authority is structurally unprepared to absorb. And for the early nation-states of the modern era, particularly the United States, whose foundational mythology rests on the concept of a virgin continent awaiting European civilization, the existence of a sophisticated Colombian population of giants would complicate the colonial narrative in ways that 19th century political architecture had neither the flexibility nor the inclination to accommodate. These are not the motives of cartoonish villains. They are the motives of institutions protecting the coherence of systems upon which enormous amounts of power and identity depend. That is precisely what makes the suppression so durable and so difficult to dismantle. Consider for a moment the full weight of what confirmation would mean. Not the cautious hedged confirmation of a single anomalous skeleton quietly acknowledged in a footnote of an academic journal, but genuine, institutionally recognized confirmation, peer-reviewed, publicly documented, and impossible to administratively contain, that a race of physically extraordinary human beings inhabited this earth prior to the civilizations that anchor our understanding of human prehistory. The implications do not stop at archaeology. They cascade. The entire chronological framework of human development would require fundamental reconstruction. The linear model, primitive nomads evolving gradually into agricultural settlements, then city-states, then empires, depends absolutely on the absence of any prior sophisticated civilization. The presence of giants, operating at architectural and organizational scales that current humanity struggles to replicate, would insert a missing chapter into human history so consequential that every subsequent chapter would need to be reread in its light. Göbekli Tepe, the 12,000-year-old megalithic complex in Turkey, whose existence already strains the accepted timeline, would no longer be an inexplicable anomaly. It would be a remnant, a fragment of a larger, older world whose full dimensions we have barely begun to excavate. The geopolitical implications are no less seismic. Indigenous oral traditions across North America, South America, Africa, and the Pacific have preserved accounts of these prior races for millennia, accounts dismissed by Western academic institutions as primitive mythology unworthy of serious scholarly engagement. Confirmation of their accuracy would represent not merely a scientific revision, but a profound moral reckoning. It would mean that the knowledge systems of colonized peoples preserved historical truths that the colonizing institutions actively suppressed. The epistemological authority that Western archaeology has exercised over the global human story would be revealed as not just incomplete, but deliberately distorted. The theological tremors would be equally profound. The Book of Enoch, the Sumerian king list, the Vedic accounts of prior races, the Popol Vuh, texts and traditions marginalized or excluded from canonical authority, would demand re-examination not as spiritual allegory, but as historical testimony. The boundary between sacred narrative and empirical record, maintained with such institutional investment by both religious and academic establishments, would become permanently and irreversibly permeable. And then there is the question that sits beneath all of these implications, quieter, but perhaps most destabilizing of all, the question of what happened to them. If a race of beings of this magnitude and sophistication existed, and if the ancient texts are consistent in describing their elimination by catastrophic global events, then the history of this planet includes at least one episode of civilizational collapse so total that it erased not merely the infrastructure of an advanced society, but the biological reality of its dominant population from the accessible geological record. That precedent of a sophisticated civilization vanishing so completely that its existence became mythology within a few thousand years, reframes every assumption we carry about the permanence of human achievement and the stability of the world we have built. We are not, it would suggest, the first complex civilization this Earth has produced. We may not be the most enduring, and the bones buried beneath our feet may belong to a world far older, far larger, and far more consequential than the history we have been permitted to inherit. There is a particular silence that settles over an excavation site at the end of a working day. The machinery stills. The voices of the field team fade into the middle distance. And what remains is the Earth itself, layered, patient, and indifferent to the narratives constructed above it. That Earth holds more than we have been told. Somewhere in a federal storage facility, in an archival box whose catalogue number references nothing more specific than miscellaneous biological specimens, pre-Columbian, there may exist a femur that changes everything. Somewhere beneath the compacted sediment of a river valley that no infrastructure project has yet disturbed, the skeletal geometry of a being outside the accepted parameters of human biology lies undisturbed, waiting with the absolute patience of deep time. Somewhere in the restricted archive of an institution whose public mission is the preservation and dissemination of human knowledge, a photograph sits in a manila folder, a photograph taken by a credentialed professional on an official excavation, documenting something that the institution has spent a century pretending does not exist. The question is not whether giants walked this earth. The convergence of physical evidence, ancient testimony, architectural forensics, and archival documentation has moved that question past the threshold of reasonable dismissal. The question, the one that the ground keeps asking, in every language, on every continent, across every century of human inquiry, is why we have been so consistently, so institutionally, and so deliberately prevented from knowing that they did. Every civilization that has ever risen has also, eventually, fallen. Every empire that has ever extended its authority over the human story has also, eventually, lost its grip on that story. The giants, if the evidence is to be believed, were no exception. They built at a scale that still humbles us. They ruled at a duration that still confounds us. And they vanished with a completeness that still, beneath all the institutional silence and academic orthodoxy, quietly terrifies us. Because if they could be erased, their bones catalogued and buried, their texts excluded and marginalized, their memory reduced to mythology, by the patient work of institutions with sufficient motive and sufficient reach, then the question of what else has been erased becomes not a paranoid speculation, but a legitimate and urgent historical inquiry. Stand at the base of the Baalbek trilithons as the sun drops below the Lebanese horizon. Run your hand along the surface of a foundation stone that no modern machine can move. Feel the weight of what was built here, and by whom, and how long ago, pressing upward through 2,000 years of Roman construction layered above it, like a footnote over an original text. Then ask yourself what you were taught, and ask yourself who decided what you should be taught, and ask yourself, in the cooling silence of that ancient place, whether the distance between those two questions is where the real history of humanity has always been waiting to be found. The ground has been asking this question for a very long time. We are only now beginning to listen.